Porch City Plate Podcast, presented by Bienville Bites Food Tour. The Porch City Plate Podcast, serving up the food, history, and people of Mobile, Alabama for people who love the Porch City. I'm your host, Chris Andrews, and super excited. Got another exciting episode on the podcast. Today's all about gumbo, and all my friends who enjoy being in the kitchen, this is going to be an episode for you, no doubt about it. David Hubbell is a Louisiana historian and expert on all things in the kitchen, especially when it comes to Cajun culture. And he is the Historiographus Regne. That is the royal historian of the Royal Order of Gumbo, which is a local Joe Cain Day parading society group. And it's going to be a fun episode. David, welcome to the Porch City Plate Podcast.
Hey, Chris. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. So, all right. So, tell me about where you grew up. I know just kind of reading on your background. I know you're not a Louisiana native,
right? But
Louisiana historian. So,
yeah,
talk about that.
Sure. Well, even though I was not born in Louisiana, my parents are from Louisiana, and about 300 years worth of ancestry goes back to Louisiana. My German and French ancestors settled there in the early 1700s, and about the time that I was born was right around the time my dad and mom were the first group of the family that left Louisiana. And my dad was in graduate school, and they moved. They got married in 1968 in Metairie, Louisiana, and they moved to Houston, Texas, for my dad to attend Rice University and get his PhD. So, by truth be told, I'm a native Texan.
Okay.
So I hope nobody holds that against me. But after living there 16 years, the theme basically in the family was that despite being in Texas, our hearts were in Louisiana. My mom and dad, I got a brother and a sister, and we would go back to New Orleans, as we called it, which was really Metairie. We go back to Metairie every year for Thanksgiving and Christmas and summer times. And those were like the happy times, because some of my aunts and uncles are just 10 years older than me, and I got to spend time with both of my grandparents and go to both of their houses, and there was always a lot of food involved. And so those were always things that we were like, we'd go back then to Texas, and it was kind of a letdown. So back in 1986, we had the oil bust throughout the country, and my dad was working with various Texas-related, he was in the petroleum industry. He was with Texas Instruments before that. And he ended up with a job with a company here in Mobile, QMS, and doing laser printers. And so he had actually applied for that job, and he had been to Mobile back when he was younger, but I had never been to Mobile. So in 1986, my senior year of high school, we moved to Mobile, and it was somewhat bittersweet, because we enjoyed the fact that now we're going to be 2 hours away from seeing our grandparents. And but the other hand, I had a lot of friends in Texas. We had gone to the state semifinals in football and got to play in Texas Stadium and all those kind of things. So we ended up here in Mobile. And then the other thing is that when I was really young, I also got interested in genealogy. And so there was also my interest always in Louisiana from that standpoint. So when we moved here in the 80s, started college at South, some of that kind of was initially strong, because being 2 hours away, it seemed like the first year we were going to Metairie like every other weekend. And so that was great. We'd always import our French breads and some of the coffees and things that we couldn't always get here and bring it back. And so my mom has always cooked Cajun Creole food. We didn't really know what it was called at that point. And so fast forward, go to college, get a job, met my wife. She's from Germany, and got married, and we were having our oldest daughter, our first child. And I started really thinking about the fact that my mother's around, and my dad was around, but my grandmother had just passed away about 3 years earlier. And I thought, if I want my daughter to learn how to do these Cajun Creole dishes, I'm going to have to step up to the plate and learn how to cook them. And so that got me interested in Louisiana food to complement my Louisiana interest in history. And then I got a hold of a book called The Encyclopedia of Cajun and Creole Cuisine by Chef John Foles. And it's like an 8-pound book. It's like 700 pages, and the first 200 or thereabouts about Louisiana history. But there's all these recipes in there that talk about the native, like the Creole tomatoes and certain ingredients, which when I started really paying attention, I realized Mobile has got a lot of those same ingredients, the abundance of seafood. But a lot of the varieties of vegetables I didn't really see here. So that got me interested in kind of focusing on growing those type of varieties, which led me down a whole other rabbit hole of Creole tomatoes and certain types of peas. And a favorite of mine is the Mirliton squash, or chayote is what most people are familiar with it as. So that basically, all those things fed into my interest and my learning and self-education on Louisiana history. And through that, I've met a lot of people who've asked me to participate in either growing discussions or history discussions or food discussions.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I've got to where I am with
All
my
right, so
expertise.
we got a lot to get into.
Yes.
What would you say, before we get into like all that, what would you say is the biggest differences between Cajun and Creole cuisine?
When you look at the differences with the Cajun and Creole, the Cajuns, the Creole culture is, by definition, was the early days, was the firstborn of the European, French, Spanish, Portuguese in the New World. And the first recorded Creole baptism was actually in Mobile in 1705, I think, 1704, 1705. Not Louisiana, not the state of Louisiana, but we were part of the first capital of French colonial Louisiana. So you had that French influence, that European influence was the main thing. But as I think you've talked about on some of your other shows and in your book, when you're trying to cook European style without European ingredients, you have to adapt. And so I think you ended up with a lot of the things that you had to learn to incorporate a lot of the foods from the Native Americans and then also the enslaved Africans that were around. So you started having your okras in there. I'm not really sure when tomatoes made it into the New World, because I know there's some difference with Thomas Jefferson and stuff. But you had your peppers coming in from the Spanish. So you had a lot of those things in those type of colonies. And then meanwhile, you had it's technically a Creole colony up in Nova Scotia with the Cajuns, but they were the French trappers, and they cleared the swamps, and they were up there in Canada. But mostly what they didn't have the access to the peppers, and most of their European cooking was more country, late 1600s. So they were kind of also living off the wild game of the area. They had seafood, but when they came down to Louisiana in about 1765, after they got pushed out by the British in the 1750s, they were kind of they didn't really want to venture out into the communities a lot. They were very close because they lost a lot of family members and they had been exiled and separated. So they got back together. And so a lot of their dishes, some people will say, are a lot of one-pot, rustic type of dishes with the kind of the old, you might have a roux base, the heavier dishes that people are familiar with. And then, the Creoles are going to be a little more, some of the French-inspired techniques. I mean, roux is really, I guess, French either way, but I think you had more like pig and hog lard going into the country Cajun cooking. And then the cities of Mobile and New Orleans, I think you might have had maybe more cows and more dairy type of bases. So, and I think Creole is also probably going to be primarily a little more seafood based with our bounty from the Gulf and the rivers.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like, especially, it's got to be difficult to distinguish the two in Louisiana, because it feels like there's, you've got the Cajun that's more, like you said, vegetables, maybe more farmland. Yeah. Whereas Creole seems to be more seafood and maybe off the river a little bit more. Would you say that?
Yeah. I mean,
but those two kind of intersect a lot as well.
Right. And I mean, I think popular media, especially of the 70s and 80s, trying to define the two groups. I think the story I've heard is like the 1984 World's Fair. The Cajun and Creole booth was like right next to each other. So when you had a lot of food writers coming in from the area, they just kind of lumped them together. And a lot of French scholars locally or in South Louisiana will tell me that they feel like that the Cajun culture is a subculture of the Creoles. So it's now today's Creole has also grown to expand into taking in the Creoles of color and the African enslaved or the free Creoles of color at that time. And so that's where you see more popularity, where there's kind of more of a distinguishing between the two with the African influences there, or the Caribbean influences, I guess is what you might really talk about from a more modern standpoint. But I mean, I know as you've studied, you could put a pin in it at a certain time, but then at the same time, things keep evolving and taking on. And if you're making your gumbo a certain way and I'm making my gumbo a certain way, and I like, you put bay leaves in there, I might have to try that. And so I can see how there's a lot of cross-pollination between the two.
Right.
So that's why it's really hard to kind of distinguish the two.
Before we started recording, we were talking about some of the restaurants in Mobile, and there's just not a whole lot of restaurants that kind of give you a true, Louisiana experience. Are we losing that a little bit? Like, would you say it's kind of dying off, or is the future of that kind of cooking, is it being preserved?
I think it's being preserved probably in the homes and the and maybe in some cases the workplaces, because a lot of people will you and I talking about past backgrounds with working in manufacturing facilities. A lot of the best cooking I've ever had has been up in the plants, the chemical plants, and so as far as a restaurant scene goes, I mean, I know it's difficult for restaurateurs to appeal to everybody, and it's hard that if you just specialize in Cajun. My idea of Cajun and somebody my what I say is I'm a background is River Parish between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, but there's even distinctions between that and say Lafayette, and then you even have coastal Cajuns down toward the coast, and you have some Spanish influenced St. Bernard Parish and such. So there's a lot of it's hard to kind of really cover that and be a really good thorough Cajun restaurant. So I don't think we're necessarily losing it in a sense. What I think what's good about Mobile is that Mobile's kind of embracing the commonalities between our cooking with the Creole backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so they may do some things that may be a New Orleans dish, but Mobile style or Mobile influence from the chefs and all who've really studied our history.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about gumbo. And first of all, I mentioned at the beginning, you're kind of the historian of the Royal Order of Gumbo. So talk about that. What is the Royal Order of Gumbo, and what y'all do?
So the Royal Order of Gumbo was founded in, I think, 2020 by Jeremiah Woolsey. He is I met him actually through the internet, through Facebook, and through my love of gardening. He heard me talking about Mirliton, and I think one of the conversations I had with Bill Finch on Plain Gardening was about the origins of gumbo and the Trinity. So anyway, Jeremiah, his mother's from Louisiana, from New Orleans, and he grew up with a Creole gumbo. He grew up in Mobile. So his gumbo had okra and seafood in it. His son's mother is from more the Lafayette area. And his son, I don't remember if his son grew up in Mobile, but was living in Baton Rouge. But his son told him that tomatoes were not a part of gumbo, and okra is not a part of gumbo. And so, Jeremiah is like, no, wait a second. This is what I grew up with. And so the two schools or the arguments of, what goes to gumbo kind of spurred him to really ask the debate on the internet or on Facebook, what is the definition of gumbo? And then as there's so much noise out there on what is a gumbo, he took it upon himself to create this Royal Order of Gumbo so that we could really uphold the fact that gumbo is often made with what you had available. And there's some recipes, if you want to call it that. There's basic outline that you probably need to follow to be called a gumbo. Some people are going to have more. They're going to say it's only got to have okra in it. Some are going to say, well, no, it's got to have filet. But he started the group, and part of as I guess mostly as a Facebook group, but then he also wanted to take it into the next level and be a marching society on Joe Cain Day. And so it's very gumbo theme. We've got the Royal Order. We've had 3 kings over the last 3 years. They'll march on Joe Cain Day. I'm not a big marcher, so I haven't participated in it. But they get the golden spoon. I think Jeremiah was our first king with the golden spoon. We've had a couple of queens, and what we do is there's like a lot of subgroups, and there'll be the folks who are what is it called, like crew crab, and then shrimp, the crevettes, the Trinitarians, which were the ones who follow the okra, the onion, bell pepper, and celery. So they'll dress in those style. They'll have bell peppers on their hats, onions on necklaces, and stuff like that. So then they got hot sauce themes. I think he says we're looking for some sassafrasses.
Okay. I like it.
So for anybody interested who wants to represent the sassafrasses, you can contact me and or check us out on Facebook, the Royal Order of Gumbo. But it's a private group on Facebook, and what we try to do is try to have thoughtful educational discussions, not in a dry standpoint, because I think you've been on the website, the Facebook page, and try to educate folks in the fact that there's a lot of noise out there and there's a lot of trash talking about gumbos. And as you pointed out, my background with my affinity for Louisiana, I was even this way, when I moved to Mobile, it's kind of like, Mobile's can't have anything that parallels Louisiana. But then as I learned the history and I learned our cultures, and also learned that I had some ancestry that came through Mobile that ended up in Louisiana, there's an appreciation there for the culture and the food. And so with that discussions, a lot of the Louisiana people will get on the pages, not on this page per se, but other pages, and they'll always post this horrendous gumbo recipe from somewhere in Alabama that's got corn and beans in it, and then they'll ridicule with the old, Alabama LSU rivalry.
Right.
And so what we try to do is, we don't want to really have any trash talking. We don't want to really, it's a private group. We want to keep everybody civil. But we want people who really appreciate cooking and eating and propagation of good gumbo knowledge. So to your point about with restaurants and the culture of Louisiana, we're trying to do our part from educating people with that.
Right. All right, so let's talk about some of those differences for sure.
Sure.
And it's only been recently where I was really kind of my mind was blown when I saw some of the conversation around, that some people are very adamant about not having tomato in gumbo.
Yeah.
And if you've eaten gumbo at restaurants in Mobile in this area, you wouldn't know any different.
Right. And in fact, New Orleans gumbos, seafood gumbos, have tomatoes in them a lot of times. And going back to what I talked about, Mobile being, I would say Mobile is the first Creole city in North America, or the New World, I guess, Gulf Coast. The gumbos I think you have in Mobile and New Orleans are similar in a lot of respects. They're going to be okra-based. They'll have some tomatoes in there, and they'll be seafood. So your Creole gumbos that's what I would call a Creole type gumbo. Maybe some oysters in it. But then you've got the other group of the Cajuns influence, which is going to be your poultry-based filet, possibly or primarily as your thickener, but really that's going to go on the tail end of a roux. And then you're going to have your sausage, your smoked meats in that. And so when I make the two types of gumbos, if I make chicken andouille gumbo, I'm not going to put tomatoes in it. It's just the recipes I followed and the ones that I preferred don't have it in there. But if I'm making a seafood gumbo, I'm going to have okra, and what I found is that, the tomatoes serve a purpose from a standpoint, the okra will thicken your gumbo, but at the same time, okra can be very slimy. And if you don't cook it down enough and you don't adjust properly, it can kind of be, the mouthfeel of that gumbo is not very pleasing for a lot of people. But with the tomatoes, the acid actually breaks down some of that. So it serves a purpose there. And so I think it's kind of a silly debate because people are saying, well, you never no tomatoes in gumbo ever. But I think it depends on what style gumbo you're making.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think, what's your earliest gumbo memory? Who made your earliest gumbo that you had? Was it a restaurant, or was your mother, grandmother? Or, think about that. That's probably what you're going to define as what a gumbo is.
That's right.
And my mom's mom would make chicken and andouille gumbo around the holidays, Christmas time. And I remember sometimes seafood gumbo. I remember the oysters in it. We didn't really, I think she put andouille in it, but I also learned that a lot of seafood gumbos, I prefer not to have sausage in my seafood gumbo. It's good to me the first day, but it's like the next day, I find the seafood gets too much of the smokiness, and it's not a good combination to my palate.
Yep.
But anyway, then there's other debates of potato salad or no potato salad. You'll see now, I guess the good thing with the social media is that everybody has the opportunity to show off what they think a gumbo is. And, if you didn't have the means to put all the different ingredients into your gumbo to make a proper gumbo, air quotes, you may not recognize it as a gumbo. And Chef John Folse, who I referenced before, he made a comment on one of his radio shows, was that when he was a kid, a neighbor or a friend of his invited him to have gumbo at their house. And he was like, man, he was excited all day. He was going to have gumbo. And but he went to this friend's house, and this woman, this guy's mom, served him a bowl of gumbo. And he looked down at it, and he's like, well, where's the gumbo? It was just he didn't recognize it as gumbo, but to this family, it was gumbo. Uh-huh. And so then you've got the Cajun traditions, which may be possibly due to the German influence of the areas. Potato salad in the gumbo versus on the side, or just rice. I've tried it. I prefer it with if I'm gonna do a chicken andouille. I don't really like it in it, but I'll take a spoon of the potato salad and a spoon of the gumbo together. But I don't really like it with seafood.
Right.
Some of the other cultures will put in a boiled egg because, out in the country, where my grandparents always referred to where their family was from, out in the country. Out in the country, you'd always end up having the big Catholic families, and you never knew when the city dwellers were going to come up and visit. And so that's when they'd end up see somebody coming down the road and realize, oh, shoot, we don't have enough gumbo. So they'd throw another cup of water in it, and then they'll put some eggs in it so everybody got some protein. So you'll see some boiled eggs occasionally in some of your rustic style gumbos. And I even learned another tradition was some people put sweet potatoes on the side. So I think every family is going to have their gumbo history and culture. And as the families expand into different regions, you have those different things. So
right.
You may put certain things in your gumbo that I don't care for, but I'll recognize it as gumbo. I'm not going to give you any heck about it either.
Well, there's so many different variations, and I guess even seasonal variations too.
Yeah.
About what you can put in your gumbo, and I guess it all goes back to like what you said earlier about you pretty much are the ingredients are what you have.
Yeah, and I think the other point too that you just reminded me of is the fact if we go back to the very beginning, especially in Mobile or New Orleans, but let's say Mobile, you had the French that settled the colony, but then you also had the Native Americans, and then you had the enslaved Africans, and a lot of people will say, well, since it's got okra, it's got to have okra in it because okra, gumbo is the African word for gumbo. I mean for okra. Sorry. The thing about it is that going to the seasonality. If you've grown any gardens, okra's only available at certain times of the year, mostly your summertime through early fall. Seafoods, I know in the past, I'm sure seafood was a lot more abundant. I'm not sure when the shrimping season is and such, but there's a fixed point in time where you had these ingredients available. So I'm going to say midsummer to early fall. We know that oysters were preferred in the R months because of the cooler, not for the spoilage. But at some point, your okra runs out, and before refrigeration, what did you do?
Right.
Now you had the Native Americans who had the sassafras trees and the dried powder that they created, what we call filet powder. Actually, their Choctaw word for that, I've read, is combo, Kombo. So you had king gumbo for the African Bantu, from the African Bantu dialect for okra, but then you had filet or combo as filet. But that would have been, you pounded that, you would harvest those leaves, I think, in August or September, dry them out, pound them into a fine powder, and then you would have that available, as long as it was dry and you had the abundance. So I think that would have gotten you into your winter type of seasonality and like the adaptation of probably the wild game more so than even chicken, because you could go out and hunt and you could probably get rabbits and squirrel and raccoon and make a gumbo with it. And then eventually for Sundays, you make your chicken gumbo. But you would probably save those also during the cooler months. And then the French influence of the roux eventually with the flour and the oils. So I think you got to have one of those three or two of those three thickeners in your gumbo base to make your gumbo.
Yep.
And so just whenever they're available, like I said, in the past, they weren't always available at the same time.
Right. What would you say is a classic Mobile gumbo? I mean, I think we kind of talked about it, but just to clarify, what would you say is a classic, just a Mobile gumbo?
What I've seen over the last several years in studying it, especially when I've tried to pinpoint just such a thing, and what my friends that early on told me what they think is in a gumbo, and I agree with them from what you see when you go to the restaurants, is it's got to be an okra-based seafood gumbo. It's got to have okra. It's got to have tomatoes. It's got to have shrimp, crab meat, and I'm thinking oftentimes I see oysters in it too. So I think that's what I would describe as your basis. It's got I'm not sure if it's roux-based or not, but I know that it's got to have at least those components from what I've seen from the old recipes and the cookbooks and the newspapers, and even what I've experienced eating out around here.
Right.
You go back really far, there's a lot of actually filet in some of the gumbo recipes, but as far as modern times, which I'll say from maybe the last 100 years, that's how I judge it or describe it.
Yeah, I think an example I think of that would be the gumbo at Wenzel's, and I know it's a what they've been around since 1938, but I know that recipe for their gumbo I think goes back to the Wenzel family, predates the 1938. So you're looking at least 100 years of that style of gumbo that we still have at Wenzel's. Yeah. Going back to gumbo and its origins, and I guess the elephant in the room question is, did gumbo start in Mobile? And
go
ahead. I in my book, A Culinary History of Mobile, of course, I kind of danced around it as well. Yeah. It's not one of those things that's definitive. We don't have any proof. There was no diary or journal of any of the explorers that mentioned gumbo. They didn't mention.
Nobody did a Facebook post the day they invented it.
They didn't. No, D'Iberville, he did not. He did not post on his Facebook page that he invented gumbo. And so anyway, so it is unclear. But kind of in my mind, and you've mentioned it earlier that there's no doubt about it. Mobile is the first Creole city. Yeah. The first Creoles lived here in Mobile, and this, we're looking at 15 years before New Orleans is founded. That's a long period of time. Yeah. That's a lot of meals. Yep. That's a lot of cooking that occurred in 15 years. Kind of my hypothesis is, that, and again, like I said, I didn't put this in the book, and I don't think it's I don't think it's fair to say that Mobile started gumbo, but you almost kind of look at it like I do with Mardi Gras,
right?
Where there's really not proof as well there that Mobile started Mardi Gras 1703. Again, D'Iberville and Bienville did not say, we celebrated Mardi Gras today on that February day in 1703.
Right.
But we claim that, and,
Right.
and we kind of use our context clues of,
Right.
it was, this was a first French permanent settlement. We had a church. We had a Catholic church by then.
Yeah.
They were very aware of the calendar.
Right.
So I think you can kind of like take all those clues and say, yeah, they likely they had some kind of celebration. They danced and drank. Of course, there were plenty of taverns up there. We talked about that on the episode with Steve Joint.
Yep.
So I think that's kind of where we claim Mardi Gras just based off those context clues.
Mm-hmm.
You could pretty much do the same thing with gumbo.
I agree. Like I said, when I did the first talk for so what we've done with the Royal Order of Gumbo is for the last 2 years, especially, we've had some fundraisers, which we'll do we've had them at the Zebra Club on DIP, and Jeremiah will do a great job of trying to get gumbo tasting music, and then will ask me to do some history. And so the first year I doing that, trying to prepare for that talk, that's kind of along those lines. I discuss, you start really thinking about it from the availability of things, because everybody always talks about, well, the enslaved Africans brought the okra. Now, the big date that I've seen along the Gulf Coast is like 1719 for slaves entering into New Orleans. But when you read about it, like you talk about the context clues, a lot of times they were stopping off in Haiti and Santo Domingo and then coming to Mobile. And even though there wasn't a big slave trade, I got to believe that the French had enslaved people with them. And so you were probably getting some okra influence at some point. The old recipes, even in the eastern coast, will have okra or gumbo recipes, but they don't look like gumbo the way we eat gumbo, but it's a reference to okra. But you had the three, I think, in the French colony, you had the French, you had the Native Americans, and you had the enslaved Africans living side by side. And like you said, we were here 15 years before a lot of them moved to, or even started in New Orleans. And so even Chef Fols, even when I talked to him about it, he says, he concedes that it's very possible that Mobile could be the birthplace of gumbo. As you were saying, we were part of the Louisiana Territory. It was somewhere in Louisiana.
It was definitely Louisiana. That's for sure.
So, we don't argue that it was in Louisiana.
Yep. Now, whether it was in Mobile or whether it was...
Maybe it was Biloxi, or maybe it was...
Good point, too, yep.
Yeah. But, just if you look at things from the historical perspective of who was there and what were they eating, you talk about it in the book. There's an abundance of seafood. So and the Native Americans, they made seafood stews with the filet, and so the French, you couldn't cook your traditional European style, French style cooking, but you had to adapt. And so you're learning from the Native Americans, and you're learning from the enslaved Africans who were learning too, but that they all came together. So, I would think in a 15-year period you had something that was, if not gumbo, was a precursor to gumbo in Mobile.
That's right.
So I agree with you on that.
That's good. That's interesting history. I've enjoyed going into that. But going forward to more modern times, like what would you say? What do you think is the most famous gumbo in the world right now?
That's a good question. Everybody's going to argue about it from one way or the other. It depends on whether you get yours out and about. I think some of the more famous ones or notable ones actually have been things like the largest ones, like in the Guinness Book of World Records. Within the last, 10, 12 years, I'm trying to look at my notes here.
What about the gumbo's a herb? That's kind of the one that kind of sticks out in my mind.
Oh, gumbo's herbs?
From Leah Chase.
Well, yeah, okay. So I guess in context, so my mind was thinking of both mostly the seafood and the Cajun Creole, but there are a couple other gumbos out there that people are somewhat familiar with, but may not agree. But gumbo's herbs is green gumbo, and That's an old Creole dish that is made famous most recently in the last 40, 50 years by the late Leah Chase at Dookie Chase's restaurant in New Orleans. It is Bill Finch and I discussed this on one of his shows, and if you really look into it, there's a lot of history into the time of the year with as the end of Lent is approaching and Easter's approaching, the springtime and the greens, or as Bill says, the tonics. And there's a German tradition where they make a green soup out of a lot of the greens that have like an odd number of greens involved in it. And she, as a Creole of color, that was something that she had always grown up with. And her restaurant started making it, and in her book, she details it, 5, 7, 9, 11, because Creoles are superstitious, is what she said. You had to have that in there for it to be lucky. But it's things like beet tops, carrot tops, mustard greens, your various other type of greens that you find. I've made it before. I actually got a video up on Facebook on YouTube that I've made with her recipe, and I think I put even lettuce in it. But it would be, you basically would cook the greens down, grind it up, and you'd save some of that liquor that you create from cooking the greens, and you make your roux. That would be your stock basically. But then you'd have a very kind of light roux with some oil. And flour. And in her case, she put in a lot of like brisket meats and some heavier meats. Chorice is like a Cajun spicy sauce, not Cajun, Creole spicy sausage. The tradition that she would serve it only on Holy Thursday in New Orleans was because as the penitent were getting ready to go and fast on Good Friday and still not really celebrating until Easter, it was something to fortify the folks before they make that long 3-day trek to sustain them. Now, there's a lot of recipes that have the gumbo zerbs that don't have any meat in it, but hers is probably, from that standpoint, if you were to say when you think of Leah Chase, you'll usually think of gumbo zerbs. And I made hers and never got it at her restaurant, and I'm not really a greens person. I really don't like greens, but it was really good. And it probably follows a little bit more of she said it was a dish, the Caribbeans have a dish called callaloo, and it's kind of if you look at it, it's like not really soupy, but it's thick, and the greens are served on the rice. Yeah. But it accompanied her fried chicken. So I made some of her recipe of fried chicken and did that at my house, and it was good. I like it.
It's an insane amount of ingredients in that dish. I know for a long time they served it at Dolphins. Chef Steve Zucker was mentored, I think worked under Leah Chase for some time, and so that was kind of his tribute to her, on the menu there. And I remember when we would take our Bienville Bites tours there, and that's what we would have. Yeah. And he would actually bring out, they had printed out the ingredients. Yeah. And I remember a lot of people would like, "You're going to give us the ingredients?" But if you look at the ingredients, you look at it and you're like, no common man or woman can make this. This is insane.
Yeah, what I ended up doing is I got all her ingredients, and I had to go to 2 stores to find all the greens.
I'm surprised it just took you 2.
Well,
that was just for the greens, though, I guess.
That's just for the greens. The brisket meat, I was able to find the brisket meat, but the chorice sausage, I couldn't find. So what I ended up doing is I found in Chef Folse's book a recipe for that sausage. So the first thing I did is I bought enough pork to just make that the sausage I needed for the recipe. So I had to make the sausage first, and then I made the gumbo. And what was funny is that I made that video on YouTube, and I put it out there, and about a year or so later, I got an email from this woman making a documentary out of Houston, and she wanted to know if she could use some of my footage of Leah Chase's recipe for her documentary, because she met with Leah Chase, but it wasn't during Holy Thursday time. So she talked about gumbo zerbs, but she didn't actually have any footage of it. And so she said, mine looked just like it. So I always joke that my gumbo zerbs was a body double for Leah Chase's gumbo zerbs in the documentary. Nice. But yeah, I still got that recipe up there on YouTube. But yeah, just you'll see it. It's condensed down to a couple of minutes, but it took it took a good part of the day because I had to, because you're with the different greens. A lot of times you got to get rid of those veins. You got to wash them, and you got to clean them, and then you got to get rid of the veins off of the hard parts, and then you got to steam it, and then you got to grind it, and then meanwhile you're also steaming some of your meats, and then you put it all together. And a normal gumbo will take maybe 3 hours or so to make if you have everything prepped.
This is going to take days, right?
But it took a better part of a day to make it.
Could you put a little Hall sausage in it?
Oh yeah, I would. In fact, probably next time I make it, I would probably, instead of going and making that sausage, I'd probably get one of their, I guess she's got a Cajun spicy sausage. That sounds like that would be a good application for it.
Yeah.
I may just have to do that next time just to show that.
So you're also referred to as Mobile's Mirliton Man. Now, what is Mirliton, and why are you referred to as Mobile's Mirliton Man?
Well, the Mirliton is it's not North American. It's a Latin American squash. It's part of the cucumber family, but most people in Mobile, if you search in either the Asian food or the international food sections or Latin American food sections, you will see it as chayote, Chayote, squash. It's a pear-shaped vining squash. It looks like a pear. It's light green is what you'll usually see, and it'll be kind of either pear-shaped or globular shaped. And most of the ones we see in the stores are kind of smooth. It's got a history in New Orleans as a family favorite because of the fact that it grows easily in little backyards, but it puts a vine out that's like 30 to 100 foot long. And this vine will put on 30 to 100 fruit in a year. So what happens is that it's also a fall producing or harvest. And so on the Louisiana tables, you will see it popular at Thanksgiving and Christmas times. And you may have seen it as stuffed mirliton, which will be stuffed with crab meat and shrimp. You basically boil the fruit, which has a single seed. Everything's edible actually on the plant and the seed. The seed and the fruit. So you can actually eat the seed, but you take that, you boil it, parboil it, scrape out the flesh out of it. You mix it with the Cajun Trinity, and then you add your shrimp and some of your spices and your crab meat, and you can put it back together, maybe add some breadcrumbs, and then you put it in there, and then you bake it. And so think of it like a stuffed squash or squash casserole of sorts. It's basically like that. You can do it in the shell, where you put it back in that hollowed out shell, which you got to be careful with because it's kind of thin, so you can't scrape too hard. Or you just put it in a casserole dish, but you can pickle it. You can make bread out of it, like a zucchini bread. Think about that. You can make gumbo out of it, actually. And so I got interested in it as I was talking about trying to do my Louisiana garden and heritage. I started looking to grow it in my backyard. And when I started looking, the only place I could find it at was one of the big box stores. So I planted it. And it's basically simple. All you do is you take the fruit, it sprouts out the bottom, and you plant it in the ground around April. And then it grows up a trellis and then goes hog wild if you're lucky. Well, I did that. But what happens is you don't really see fruiting or flowering until September. Well, the first one I did, it grew, made a nice 20, 30, 40 foot long vine. And I finally started seeing flowers around mid-November. And then I finally saw one fruit around Thanksgiving Day. It's about the size of a walnut. And then I woke up the next day, walked out my door where I could see my vine, and my mirliton was not there. My vine was, but my fruit wasn't. It was on the ground, and it had little teeth marks in it from a squirrel. Well, I was disappointed, to say the least. Then, of course, wintertime came and I had to cut it back, and it actually died. But as I started researching, I realized that the heirloom varieties that they grow in Louisiana are different than the ones you get in the grocery stores. So the heirloom varieties actually tend to flower in early September to mid-September here, Mobile as well as Louisiana. It's a tropical or subtropical type of fruit. So it'll grow good along the Gulf Coast, especially between Beaumont, I'll say, parts of Texas, Pensacola, and South Florida. You can't go too much further than, say, Montgomery, really, without having to do a lot of protection. But when I started looking for it, I couldn't find an heirloom variety in Mobile. And so I reached out to a guy named Dr. Lance Hill in New Orleans, who had started the Mirliton.org group. Because he came from Kansas, and he was a Tulane professor. And when he was first down in the 70s, a neighbor brought him a bag of this fruit or vegetable that he wasn't familiar with. And he instantly fell in love with it. And so he had a strong desire to keep it going. And after Katrina, he realized when he looked around for vines and people growing it in New Orleans, he couldn't find it. And a lot of the theories were that with all the flooding, a lot of the salt intrusions, and all the other pollutants that were in the water at the time, that it killed off the vines. In reality, if you have too much water on the Mirliton vines, that in and of itself will kill it. So he had started the group and had a program called Adopt a Mirliton, where you get an heirloom variety, you plant it, and you'd put like 10% of it back to sell, and bring it back to the farmer's market there in, I think it was Crescent City Farmer's Market in New Orleans. I wrote to him, and I didn't get a lot of response. But I also realized at the time he was pretty busy, because what had happened is that when he found out, even though he couldn't get them in New Orleans, he found out they could get them in the outlying areas of Lafayette, Opelousas, the river parishes, maybe the North Shore. And so they got a lot of the heirlooms back, and there were probably parts of New Orleans. So he identified about 16 different varieties, some light green, because it's light green in shape. Like I said, pear-shaped. It's got kind of furrows in it. It's about 3/4 of a pound to a pound in size. But there are also some rare white varieties that were out there. And I found out that my grandfather's brother, and a friend of his, my grandfather, he was still around in 2008. Name was Dan Boudreaux. And Dan was in his 90s, and he'd been growing them forever, and he had some. So my uncle got me a few, brought it to my dad's house in Fairhope, and it turned out that all but one survived. My dad planted that in Fairhope, and vine went wild. Around late November, I started telling my dad, well, we need to look and see. You got to be picking them about now. Have you seen any? He goes, yeah, I got about 10. So I went out there one day, and he and I started digging, and we just had them on a couple of sawhorses. And at the end of the picking, we had a bucket full of 65 Mirlitons.
Wow.
And so there's a picture out there on the internet of, we cleaned them up and put them on this little island there, but in the kitchen. So I took 2 of those and I put them in my yard. And then I sent the picture to Dr. Hill. And I don't want to say I got his attention, but anyway, he was inquisitive about where I got it and finding out about it. And so it turned out, like, for the longest time, that I was about the only person I know of in Mobile that was growing it. And then Dr. Hill had some health problems, and he kind of was off the radar for a while. And so he was called the Mirliton Man, just the Mirliton Man. So when I was trying to propagate it and keep it going, I set up a Facebook page called Mirliton Man in Mobile. And then Dr. Hill, his health problems improved, and we started working a lot together, and then he asked me to actually be second in command with the group. So he and I have been working closely with some restoration projects with one of those rare white Mirlitons, where we engaged actually Chef John Folse to grow some at his White Oak Estate and Gardens in Baton Rouge. And so that's the other thing that really keeps me active, is helping people get the heirloom varieties. Like I said, there's about 16 different ones, and the one that I grow, he told me he couldn't identify it as a known one, so I named it after Mr. Boudreaux and my mom's uncle. His last name was Robert or Robert, so it's Boudreaux Robert is the variety that I grow. And I've been successful with my vines kept coming back, but in addition, I've gotten people out in Fairhope, Spanish Fort, parts of Mobile, who have taken their vine and been able to grow it. So I had a nice vine last year, but I didn't make but one. But some of my grandbaby Mirlitons are doing well in Fairhope and I think Midtown Mobile.
Very nice.
But Mobile in South Alabama actually has had a Mirliton history. There's a gentleman who was from Louisiana, ended up, I can't remember how far north of, I don't remember if it's Washington County or just a county north of there, or Clark or so. But he brought some, and he was growing them in the early 70s up there. And if you look at even the old Winn-Dixie ads from the mid-70s, they called them Mirliton. And so people who want to get them here will tell me they remember. So I'm in my mid-50s, but these people are like in their 60s or 70s, and they said, yeah, my dad grew them in Midtown, or my dad grew them out by Davidson High School. And so it's not real popular, but yet people know about it. And then I've also spread the word by talking to Bill Finch on Plain Gardening and try to make it more and more popular. So it's a fun thing. And some of the restaurants, in fact, you talked about Dauphines. I think Chef Zucker had that as a side, like maybe it was a coworker of mine went there for his anniversary dinner, and he's telling me about this thing, and he said, "Is that the thing you grow?" And I said, "Yeah."
I was going to ask you if any of the restaurants that you know of have ever served it.
Yeah, we also appeared in the Mobile Bay Monthly last October talking about that, and one of the places, like I said, Dauphines had it, and I don't remember what the restaurant is out there in Oakley.
The Hummingbird Way?
I think that's where it is now, but it was prior to that. Whatever
so
it was,
Kitchen on George.
I think it was Kitchen on George. I think I found that they had a stuffed one with crawfish.
Okay, really?
Yeah. So anyway, it's been gaining popularity, and actually I talked on one of the other radio shows, and I actually made a special Mirliton casserole with Mobile in mind. And you'll like this because of the fact that when I made it, I used Hall sausage and Gulf shrimp, and I don't know if you ever had T. Roy's Swamp Shake made up in Washington County. I think it's Washington County. But anyway, it's a locally made Creole seasoning blend. And I made that, and it was well received, and I've made it a couple of times. But anyway, that was I used the Cajun andouille, or the andouille sausage from Hall's for that.
Yeah, nice.
So
if anybody's interested in growing Mirliton, like how can they get in touch with you, or how can they get the process going on that?
So there's a couple of ways. You can check out mirliton.org on Facebook, mirliton.org, or just type that into Google and you'll come up with the website. And then my email address, rpcajun2r@gmail.com, will come up. You can find information. I've got like 60 Mirliton growing videos on my YouTube channel, David J. Hubbell, and some recipes on how to cook them as well. So you can contact me, and I'll get you in touch with whether I have them or whether somebody else has them. Actually, we have a woman in Pensacola has a community garden, and she did wonderful this year.
Really?
Yeah, so she got me some to get to some of the people up around this area. So like I said, we got 2 varieties of white growing in the area. Jeremiah's growing one of them. A friend of mine, Joe's growing another one in Spring Hill. Another gentleman growing them throughout Washington County, and then another guy is growing some in Spring Hill, off of Spring Hill Avenue. So hopefully we'll get a network going, and that we can get it to people. And typically you'll see them in the fall. So if you're listening to this in the spring and you want to plant one, you'll have to be patient. There may be some spring crops that you could plant, but more than likely just wait till about November, December. Get on our mailing list, start inquiring, start learning how to grow them, and then you'll be all set. But you need the heirloom. Do not plant the store-bought, because the store-bought will make you a beautiful vine. If you just want to eat the shoots or the roots, then do that. But if you want the fruit, you need to plant an heirloom variety.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
All right, so all this stuff that you mentioned, so you mentioned a lot of your videos. All that's on your YouTube channel?
Yes.
Okay, so all the cooking videos and...
I've got about 6 or 7 gumbo videos of the varieties.
Yeah.
The gumbo Arabs, the red bean gumbo is another River Parish favorite one, which is a lot of people won't recognize it, but it's basically kind of a roux-based red beans and rice. Hall sausage would be good in that too, actually. That is a good one. And then there's one that actually is in Mobile's history, that a lot of people may not recognize, but gumbo choux. Do you know what gumbo choux
No,
is?
not familiar.
Okay, CHOU. That's a French term for cabbage. And actually, one of the women who was getting one of these melitons from me, I knew a family member from her niece or cousin and my daughter in school together. But we were talking, and her husband asked me if I knew what gumbo choux was. And I said, it's cabbage gumbo. And she looked at me, and she was surprised. But she's of an old Mobile Creole family. And I think actually in the Gulf City cookbook from 1878 from the Methodist Church here in Mobile, St. Francis Street, they actually have a gumbo choux recipe in there too.
Okay.
So it's a little different. I've got a recipe my grandmother's on there, and it's kind of, think of it as a smothered cabbage in a stock, and then you can put in some bits of sausage and stuff. It's really pretty good. The thickener I used was milk, which I thought was odd.
Interesting, yeah.
But I think there's maybe a little flour in it too. But I made it, and I was skeptical, and I was really surprised.
Yeah.
It was really good. But don't think of it as a seafood or a chicken gumbo. Just think of it as another variety of the gumbo family.
Right, yeah, kind of like what we've been talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Gulf City cookbook, and
Yeah.
you brought me a little gift,
Yes.
some okra gumbo. So tell
Yes.
me about this okra gumbo.
So in the past, trying to research gumbos, and oftentimes when the debate between Louisiana and New Orleans and Mobile, you'll see, well, who had the first gumbo recipe? Who had the first jambalaya recipe? And the thing about it is that there may be other cookbooks out there, but on the, I guess it's Library of Congress, you can find a copy of the Gulf City Cookbook put out by the St. Francis, what is it, the Methodist?
Francis Street, yeah, Methodist Church.
Methodist
St. Francis
Episcopal
Street Methodist
Church,
Yeah.
from 1878. And all the things that you'll find in there are very familiar if you're from New Orleans. But it predates, I think, two popular ones from New Orleans was like a Creole, I can't remember if it's called the Creole Women's Cookbook, and then there's Lacadio Hearn is a real famous cookbook from the 1884 in New Orleans, 1885. And it was very interesting that this predates it by 5 to almost 5, not quite 10, but years that you see these recipes. So I've been wanting to try this. And this, with these old gumbos, one of the things I pointed out with the early discussion is you don't have the Trinity in there. You don't have even roux. Basically, it was onions, maybe parsley as your Trinity or mirepoix, and then you would thicken it with your okra or filet, and then it would be whatever protein, whether it was seafood or chicken. So this one, I knew you talked about, you like okra in your gumbo.
Yep.
And so I was looking around trying to figure out, I had some okra that I'd grown in my yard, and I've been wanting to try this recipe for a while, or these recipes. I think there's 7 in there. And so the chicken it was a chicken, it had tomatoes, and it has okra, and your stock is just boiling water and salt and pepper. And you sprinkle the chicken with flour, and then you fry it, or brown it, as they say. And then you put your onions in there, and then you put your okra in there. And then once you brown all that, then you add your boiling water and your tomatoes. Now I got canned tomatoes that were diced. I probably should have really gotten more petite diced, I think is what you would call it. And then you cook it for 3 hours. And so I tried to take all the bones out. So just to let you know, I've tried to do it the old school way with the bones, the whole chicken. So you got white and dark meat in there, but it cooked down, and I was really surprised because as I looked at it over the 3 hours of cooking, I was like, it looks just like a regular roux-based gumbo to me. It has the color to me. Now, it doesn't have all the extra things that you would have today. Now, I did use bacon grease as what I browned everything with. But when you get that caramelization of those onions and the okra gets the darkened, you get some of the dark flavors down there, that gets that liquid, gives your clear liquid the color that you need for your gumbo. And the okra basically kind of cooks down to, you see the okra seeds, but to me it's just as, I mean, I consider it a legitimate gumbo because even though it doesn't have our modern trinity in it, and it doesn't have even a roux, I mean, you kind of make a roux with browning the flour off the chicken. But I've even heard of cultures in South Louisiana will brown onions down, a lot of onions down, and you get those sugars off of that, and you get the color, and they make the roux from that. And so I think it's sort of along that same basis.
Yeah.
So I'll be interested to see what you think when you get a chance to try it.
I'm excited to try it.
It's not spicy. I try to put enough salt in there that it was tasteful. But what I do, if I were to do it kind of as a more modern version, I'd say I'd boil my chicken separately. The problem is because at least that way you can pull out the bones and make your stock. But you just have to be careful with it. And like I said, I probably have a little bit smaller pieces of tomato. 3 hours, I think, might have been I think our modern chickens are probably cook faster than the old ones.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because if you have the old tough hen or something, it would have taken 3 hours. I think you could have got by with about 2 hours on this one when the meat's just falling off. So like I said, as far as whether you like it or not, I just follow the recipe.
Hey, that's it. No, I'm excited. I just to have an old Mobile recipe, an old Mobile dish like that. Yeah, it's just cool,
Yeah.
So I'm going to enjoy it just for the history of it.
Well, I'm glad. I hope you do. And like I said, I'd put some smoked sausage in there or something now to just add to it. If you need to put some Tabasco or some hot sauce of your preference, I could see doing that too. But it's just kind of neat because, like I said, I kind of hope to go through and do all of the old ones at one point.
Yeah.
Just to try them.
Right.
Because the curiosity as we talked earlier, what does a gumbo have to have in it? And everybody says, well, you got to have a roux. Well, you kind of have the roux, but you got a thickener. You got to have your trinity, or I don't like when everybody calls it the Holy Trinity. I call it Cajun Trinity is what I prefer.
Yeah.
And that's a Paul Prudhomme phrase from the 70s, but in the cookbooks, you start seeing, you don't really think about it like we talk about. Okra was only available seasonally. Onions really were always around. But celery, that's the thing Bill Finch and I were talking about. You don't really grow celery on the Gulf Coast. Celery is more of a cold climate vegetable.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah.
So you can find references in the old New Orleans papers, and I haven't had as much of the old Mobile papers that I can get online to check. But you have to have the certain conditions, and it's like 110, 120 day crop. And so once again, even when your celery would be available, you could probably have dried it out. I don't know how well they would have done that in the past. But they would have used, like I said, mostly onions and parsley. And so, celery doesn't come on the scene that I see in a lot of newspaper or cookbooks until like the 1920s. And then about the 1940s, you start really seeing bell peppers. And then really the ubiquitous comment of the roux I start seeing around the 1950s. Although people will tell me, I got a 100-year-old recipe that had a roux in it. I'm not saying it didn't exist. It's just like you've done before when you've looked for the research. Unless you have that data point that says, or somebody's diary that said, this is how we did it.
Right.
You just have to speculate.
Yeah.
So
another little interesting side note too on the Gulf City cookbook. Inside there is the oldest recipe for jambalaya that we know of. So I think that's another really interesting, a connection between, certainly a dish that's synonymous with New Orleans and Louisiana.
Yeah, they don't have a pastelaia one in there, but but I'll have to try that too. The jambalaya.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see. Yeah. It's got to be difficult as well. I mean, you have to certainly be a talented chef, I think, in my mind, to pull off some of these recipes out of these old cookbooks.
Yeah, because I mean that's a good point. Because if you read the different cookbooks, you realize there's a certain level of cooking skill that they assume you have. Leah Chase's cookbook to me didn't have a lot of details. I mean, if you read through this one, you'll see that it's just basically they did a good job of giving me the quantities, which was good. But it says brown it, and doesn't tell you what kind of oil to use, doesn't tell you how long, it just says brown it. So you have to know some way about controlling your heat and your temperature and your times. And then there's others that go through and do a lot better step by step. And I try to do that somewhat with my videos. Is if I'm going to recreate something, is I'll try to show the steps so that people, if they're trying to replicate it, they can do it that way.
Yeah.
So.
Let's move on to the next segment of the podcast.
All right.
It's called Meat and Three.
All right.
So we've gotten into the meat of the gumbo of the podcast, and so I got 3 questions for you. Just
Okay.
3 rapid fire, random questions. And I guess the first one's probably going to be pretty obvious. What's your favorite gumbo in Mobile?
In Mobile, I think Winsel's has got to be my favorite. I also know that there's a lot of gumbos in Mobile that I have not tasted yet, and I think that's something that I need to put on my bucket list, or even maybe get the Royal Order of Gumbo. Maybe we need to do a gumbo crawl or something
I'll say
like
you
that.
need to do your own gumbo food tour.
Yeah. Well, actually, Pepper and I talked about that maybe that's something that if you need another idea for something, maybe you
That's
can
what we need to do.
focus on the different gumbos around the downtown, because I'm sure there's, just
all the different variations,
the different
like we
variations.
talked about.
Yeah. Maybe a cool month would be when gumbo season hits.
Yep.
But so I think right now of the ones I've tasted that you can get at a restaurant, I would definitely say Winsel's is probably my favorite.
I do love the one at Winsel's. That is a good gumbo.
Yeah.
What about some other favorite places that you like to go? You and your wife. Where's some other places you like to go to eat around Mobile?
Probably the favorite place that we've come across in the last year or 2 years is Poor Baby out in West Mobile.
Yeah.
We went in there for her birthday we were just going to have drinks and with the tapas small plates.
Right.
And we started getting all these different things, and it was like phenomenal. And she told the waiter, she's like, or maybe it was the owner, I can't remember which one it was, but she's like, this is my favorite place in Mobile. So if we're going out for formal dining, it doesn't hurt that it's only 5 minutes from my house.
Yep.
But the other thing that we enjoy doing is the food pack on Old Shell Road.
Right.
It has that kind of feel of an old, if you've ever been to Central Grocery in New Orleans with the milk muffaladas, if you're familiar with that, it's kind of like in downtown Mobile. The shop, the Central Grocery, is in the old area, has all the fragrant seasonings that are out in the sandwiches they're making. Well, Food Pack is out between Spring Hill College and South Alabama, and they've been there about 30 years, and he's got some phenomenal spices and boutique wines and stuff, and some other imported foods, but he makes the gyros, I can't remember how to pronounce it right, but his gyros are very good. And so we'll go out there, and a lot of times I'll ask her, you want to go here, you want to go here? And so she's usually pretty happy with just going there to get that in Mobile. One place I want to go, which I hadn't been in a while, but we used to enjoy a lot, was Market by the Bay in Daphne.
Right, yeah.
Really like their...
they've got a good gumbo.
I've heard that, and I have had plenty of the fried shrimp po' boys, but I would like to try their gumbo.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
I'd almost say that needs to be your right there at the top of the list for sure.
Yeah. So, and they also were a sponsor of some of the events that we've done with the Royal Order of Gumbo.
Okay.
They have, Halls has, Naaman's has. So we've had a lot of great folks that when we're trying to raise funds, I should add with the Joe Cain parade, Pepper will point out the fact that the average age of the group is about 70. So I'm one of the younger ones. And so
you bring it down a little bit.
Yeah. But he's over the years, I guess, I don't know how long the route is on Joe Cain Day. I know that for the bands playing in the other parades, it's about a 3-mile hike. But they've been trying to get these adult tricycles. And so that's part of the fundraising is to do that. So these folks, like I said, Halls, Naaman's, Market by the Bay, and a lot of others have really embraced helping us out by offering deals so that when you buy a ticket for the raffle, you can get out, and it helps support us and raise the funds for what they need. So if anybody wants to support the Royal Order for something, when I had my jelly business, I was a sponsor too and gave away some jelly too.
Yeah.
So I definitely think I got that on my list to go across the bay and get some of that gumbo.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, my third question for you is, what would you say is a restaurant in Louisiana that's just like a must visit for an authentic Cajun experience?
Well, yeah, for the Cajun experience, if you wanted to do the old dance hall, it's been a long time, but they used to have like mulots out in Opelousas. The problem that I have is that I tend to do a lot of home cooking or know people who like to do a lot of cooking. So we tend not to actually go out as much unless I'm doing stuff on business. So luckily I've been able to work some in Baton Rouge and Mandeville recently. So on a recent trip, tried the Chimes out in Covington with some coworkers, and then also the Abita Brew Pub. And so those both have good representations of some Cajun food. They're probably also a little more eclectic, not exactly authentic in the you're not going to have the Cajun and the Zydeco music playing and what people perceive. But the other place that I often go to is Middendorf's Seafood. They're in Manchac, but they also have a place in Slidell, and they're known for their thin-fried catfish. Okay. So if you find yourself over there, if you haven't been to Middendorf's before, you can get a small plate of thin-fried catfish. It's like eating, my coworker, when I introduced him to it, we were there early, and he was on a keto diet or something like that. He says, well, I can eat the fried fish. I'll just take the breading off. I'm like, well, this is really thin-fried. You can't. Anyway, he bit into it, and I really think his eyes rolled in the back of his head like, oh, my God, this is delicious. And so after that, every time we would have to go to the plant we were visiting, he's like, if we leave your house at 8:30, we can get to Middendorf's when it opens at 11 o'clock, and we can get lunch first. And so one
Smart
year,
man.
Yeah, so it was like four times in 1 year for me was like the record. But a small plate will have a couple of fillets that are thinly fried, crisp, some hush puppies, some fries. And that's what I would suggest people get. And then they've got gumbos. They've got, I'm sure they got etouffees, got stuffed crab, right? Stuff like that. Okay. But after talking about going to the Chimes, I was excited to find out that there's supposed to be one coming to the Fairhope area. That's right. Yeah. The old Winsel's location in Fairhope, Point Clear. Yeah. Off 98, yeah. Like I told you, I think that's where I had my first Winsel's Gumbo. There too. Okay. So I'm looking forward to going back there. Yeah, that'll be good. That'll be a good experience then for people to go check out. Yeah. All right, next segment of the podcast called Chris's Dishes. Okay. And this is where I talk about the best dish that I've had lately. And if you've got a dish that you've had lately, maybe you want to think about, I'll turn it over to you. But sure. Mine is from Chicken District. And we had Danielle on with Chicken District on the podcast a couple episodes ago, and she mentioned a secret menu item that's on the menu there in Chicken District, and it's the loaded okra. And so when she talked about that, I thought I had to go get it. Yeah. So I went in there the other day, and I got the hot honey garlic wings that she had talked about on the podcast. Okay. Got those. Great. Love those. Definitely recommend that. And then I got the loaded okra for my side, and loaded okra they have great fried okra there, but she put some queso and some ranch on the okra. Now you could probably you can put green onions and you can put jalapenos and like really go crazy with it. I kind of went moderate, with just the ranch and the queso. I guess you could call that moderate, but that was what I. That was what I did, and I have to say it was really, really good. I enjoyed it, and so I would definitely check out the secret menu item of the loaded okra there at Chicken District when you go in the Insider Food Hall. I heard that episode, and you got me intrigued. Yeah. So and the wings are great, and if the loaded okra ain't your thing, hey, just get the fried okra because that fried okra is legit good. Yeah, we like doing fried okra at the house. I don't know. The problem is, I've got a decent sized garden, but I'm trying to plant a little bit of everything. So I'll plant okra, and what ends up happening is I'll make enough okra to make a good pot of gumbo, and that's like my first priority. And then after that, I'll fry it. So my wife and daughters like the fried okra, so may have to do that just to get them a fried okra. There fix. You go. Yeah, that's right. Well, do you have a dish you've had lately, whether you've cooked it at home or been out to eat? Well, it's got to be this gumbo I brought you today. But no. We went out when I was doing out in Mandeville 2 weeks ago. The interesting dish I had that really was pretty good was at the Abita Brew Pub. And it was a boudin stuffed quail. And so they had two quails. You had boudin in there, obviously. And then you deep fry it. And then you have some type of blueberry sauce they have on top. And it's served on it's like a Cajun cornbread with dressing with some andouille. and they had some sautéed vegetables and I guess some not sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes with it. That was very good. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and I could see myself trying to make that at the house just to see if I could replicate it. But that, as far as something that I've been out and had recently, that's what I would say.
That sounds good.
And there's a lot of things on that menu there that my coworkers they raved about the jambalaya, because they said that they have never had so much meat in the jambalaya.
Really?
They had two of the four guys, me being one of the four, had that jambalaya, and they raved about it.
Yeah.
I almost wanted to take my spoon and go over and...
Man, I had a jambalaya a couple of weeks ago, and I ain't going to say where it was from, but man, there was no meat in it. I mean, no chicken, no sausage, anything. So, yeah, that's can't have that. Anyway, I won't go on that. I'll save that rant for some other time. But David, man, it's been an awesome episode. I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, no problem.
I definitely appreciate you and helping put Gumbo on the map and Mobile's food scene and the Gulf Coast. Our whole food culture. On the map. I'm certainly passionate about that. And, and know you are too. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And after talking to, I even suggested to my boss. I said, when we take not clients, but coworkers from other plants throughout the world, they come and visit us in Mobile. We hit a couple of restaurants locally, but after looking at your website, I started thinking, I was like, why don't we, think about if they're going to be here for a couple of days, that would be a really cool thing to do, is to take the tour and introduce them to a lot of places, but then also get the history. And so he pulled up the website and he goes, "Oh, there's team building one there too."
That's right.
He's like, "Maybe we'll just do that with the team building." I'm like, "Hey,
that's exactly what you need to do." Yep.
So hopefully I'll get to see you on
all right, sounds good. I like that. Yeah, I look forward to that. And that's definitely that's the whole point of the tour, really. Is for people, if you're here for a short time, is to let you taste the iconic dishes of Mobile, what we're known for, and give you some backstory on it, and give you a chance to go to places like Wenzel's. And some of the popular places in Mobile. So, Well, David, I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thank y'all for listening to the Porch City Plate Podcast, and we'll check you on the next episode.